So welcome everyone to this new appointment of the Digital Classicist Seminar. It's my pleasure to introduce Lieve Van Hoof, who will present today about the Digital Social Network Analysis and Ancient Literature, Libanius Epistolary Ego-Network. Lieve has a PhD in Classics, and she studied also history and politology in Leuven and Ghent. She's affiliated with institutions in Germany and in the UK as well. And her current research is about the relation between society and literature, mainly Greek but also Latin, under the Roman Empire. But I leave it to you now.
Okay. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to come to Berlin, which is always a pleasure, and to give me the opportunity to come and present my work here to you. Although, as you will see, it's very much work in progress still. Ich entschuldige mich auch, dass ich nicht auf Deutsch reden werde heute, aber wir können ruhig in der Diskussion auch auf Deutsch reden, das ist wie ihr möchtet. Aber ich werde meine Vorlesung also auf Englisch halten. Now, although I shall be speaking for an audience which I realize is well acquainted both with digital humanities on the one hand and with classical studies on the other, I'm not sure whether all of you, every single one of you, is familiar with social network analysis, and I'm also not sure, or maybe even less sure, that all of you are familiar with this author I'm going to speak about, Libanius. So in the 40 minutes of my paper, I shall first tell you something about social network analysis in general. I shall also say something about how social network analysis has already been applied within the field of classics. I shall then very briefly say something about Libanius, and then I shall then spend the main part of my paper setting out how I am trying to apply social network analysis to the letter collection of Libanius. Social network analysis has been defined as the methodical analysis of social networks. A social network being the social structure consisting of a set of actors, and these actors can be individuals, but can also be organizations or can even be objects on the one hand, and the ties or links between these actors on the other. Now, this methodology has its origins on the one hand in anthropological, psychological and sociological research on people's social networks, and how people interact with their peers and with others. And on the other hand, in mathematical and in mathematics and computer sciences, which have looked into graph theory on the one hand, and also on how you can calculate networks and specific elements in networks, to which I will come in a minute. And I think that especially since the 1970s, these two fields have known a great synergy, which has led to a major leap forward in social network analysis. And the two most famous probably outcomes of that, both dated in the first half of the 1970s, which you probably have heard about, are on the one hand Milgram's small world theory, which is this theory that says that through a maximum of 6 people, every one of you, can reach, say, Barack Obama or any other person in the world. And on the other hand, Granovetter's theory of the strength of weak ties, which means weak ties are the ties or the interactions we have with people whom we do not interact with very often. And Granovetter showed, making use of the work that had been done before, showed that these weak ties, these people who tend to be more different from us, who we do not interact with very often, that they greatly expand our network, because these people are usually located in a sphere which is different from ours, and therefore know a group of people that are different from, say, the people your partner or your best friend knows, who are more likely to be the same group of people. The real, even a bigger leap forward for social network analysis has taken place in the 1990s, and that also in the field of classics. And this boom in the 1990s and 2000s, and especially also the fame which social networks have gained with the wider public, has everything to do, of course, with social network sites online, such as Facebook, for example. Because these social network sites have not only allowed people to consciously build out their own networks, but also have raised an awareness of the fact that people have a network, that there is such a thing as a social network. People's relations, people's networks of friends on Facebook can indeed be represented in graphs such as this one, and that's what most people think of when they hear of social network analysis. Now, in order to get such a graph, very simply what you need to do is you need to construct two databases. One is called the node list, in which you include every person, or well, in this case person, but it can also be organizations, as I said, or object or whatever. So every person that is on Facebook, that has to do with one particular person in this case, and you list, for example, attributes of these nodes. Say where these people live, what their religious affiliations would be, what kind of music they like to listen to, and what you want to include in your network. So that's your first database, your node list. And then you need a second database, your edge list, in which you will list all the interactions between those people. So whether they befriend each other, whether and if so, how many exchanges there are between these people, whether they make recommendations or have common friends, etc. And then you pull these two databases together through specialized social network software, and that will give you a graph such as this one. However, what social network software does, and which I think is at least as important as giving you a nice graph, is that it allows you to make calculations. It allows you to calculate for the network as a whole how dense the network is. And density of a network is, there is a number, always depending on how many people there are in the network, there is a maximum number of theoretically possible relations between these people. And the density of a network is a percentage of these possible relations which is actually made real, which is actually put into practice. So, for example, in this network, there's no interaction between this person and one of the other dots up there. So it's not, and you never ever have 100% density in a network. But that's what density means. And then there is three other elements which are particularly interesting, which you can calculate through social network software, and that those each have to do with individual nodes in the network. The first is the degree centrality of a node, which means how many connections does a particular node, which I'm now interested in, how many connections does that node have? That's degree centrality. Then there is different kinds of centrality, and namely, above all interesting, is betweenness centrality, and that means the number of times that a node is the only connection in between two other nodes. Yeah, so that's of course a very strategic position within a network. If you have a very high betweenness centrality, you're the only person or organization connecting loads of people to one another. That gives you, of course, a very central position. And then the last centrality, kind of centrality we measure is and there's many others in fact, but these are the three main ones, is closeness centrality. And that's the sum, that's for one single node, the sum of all its pathways through to the other nodes in the network. Now, as this little example already shows, graphs, such as the one I just showed, should not be considered the only or even the main aim of network analysis. And I think that the matrices or the calculations which you can make give you much more detailed information, in fact, than you could ever see from a single graph, especially when the graph gets very complex. Another don't of social network analysis is to say, like, the conclusion I'm going to reach is that networks matter, that networks are important. Of course, we think if you are going to start a social network analysis, you think by definition that networks are going to matter to a smaller degree or to a larger degree. That's what you will find out. But of course, they will matter. But the aim is to describe exactly which node matters in what respect, and how much it does and why it does so. And so I think what most social network analysts agree on is that the term social network should not be used as a mere metaphor, but you should really engage in a formal or structural analysis of such a network. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say just by way of introduction for those of you who are not familiar with the methodology. So how has it been applied to the ancient world? Since the 1990s, I think within the field of classics, there's two main areas in which SNA has been applied. And the first is the history of ideas and especially of religion. In 1992, two works actually came out in this respect, and one is Michael White's study of the pagan revival in the 380s AD in Rome, for which he showed that this was actually very much a family affair, as it has been called, so that family relationships mattered very much in who was and who was not involved in this pagan revival. And in the same year, Elizabeth Clark published a book on the Origenist controversy, and she showed that social relationships played at least as large a role in determining people's stance in this religious debate as did their religious beliefs. And very similar to Elizabeth Clark's book is a much more recent one, I think 2007, Adam Shor's book on Theodoret's people. So again, looking into the social dynamics that contributed to shaping the Christological debates of the mid-5th century. The second area within the field of classics where SNA has been applied is archaeology, as social network analysis is an ideal method for mapping the relations or interactions between settlements, the spread of materials, the spread of innovative techniques, and so on. And as a result of the applications in these two fields, and also contributing to these publications, there have been two major conferences dedicated to social network analysis in the ancient world. One took place in 2006 in Rethymno in Crete, was termed very generally Networks in the Greek World, and I was not present there, but the proceedings have in the meanwhile been published. And if you look at those proceedings, I think half of the papers really do very innovative, good, hardcore social network analysis. In the other half, or in some of the papers at least, networks remain very much a kind of metaphor, so the kind of model which I've argued against, or which I talked about earlier. And the second conference that took place last year in Southampton, and I was present there, and Matteo was present there as well. Now, whilst many great papers were in fact presented at these conferences, and the Southampton one was really, I think, a splendid conference, and very, very innovative, very focused as well on network analysis and showing its variety. What struck me as a classical philologist was the preponderance of historians and archaeologists and the near total absence of any philologists. Now, this is all the more striking, I think, as one of the most often quoted studies in social network analysis tout court is Paul MacLean's 2007 study called The Art of the Network, and I read the subtitle, Strategic Interaction and Patronage in Renaissance Florence, which is in this book, Paul MacLean used, well, hundreds of letters which we have from Renaissance Firenze in order to show how the Medici family built up their network and how it came to be that they were in such a powerful position, whereas they were not at the beginning of the time frame he was studying. A very different application of social network analysis to a corpus of letters is Margaret Mullet's study on Theophylact of Ochrid. That's an 11th century bishop. Also a very, really, I think, work of excellent scholarship, but very different in setup from MacLean's work. I think Margaret Mullet almost made no use of digital methodologies available, and so therefore she focuses on very small groups of friends, very small-scale interactions, which you can, which she did absolutely a brilliant job in explaining and in setting out and in drawing attention to, which you can still see relatively easily with your own eyes without having to do the big network analysis. And I think that her study shows both the potential of social network analysis for an epistolary corpus, but also the need or the desirability of using digital support for that analysis. Notwithstanding these examples, within classical antiquity, there is, as far as I know, only one application of social network analysis to an epistolary corpus. And that's actually, I think, one of the very first applications of SNA to antiquity at all. And it is a study by Michael Alexander and James Donofsky of some small 300 letters of Cicero. And through this analysis, they were able to show that senators and knights actually occupy a very structurally a very similar position within Cicero's network, against an opinion which had long been held before. I myself, I'm currently trying to write a monograph on the letters of Libanius, and an important place in this monograph will be taken up by a social network analysis. So, who is this guy I'm working on? Libanius lived in the 4th century AD. His life spans almost the whole 4th century. He lived in Antioch, which is one of the most important cities of the Roman Empire, situated on the border of modern-day Turkey and Syria. And what we have of him is 64 orations, a relatively large number of school exercises, amongst which 51 declamations, but also a lot of other things, and then 1,544 letters. Now, 1,544 letters means that this is the largest epistolary corpus which we have from antiquity, or which has been bequeathed to us from antiquity. And at that, the letter collection or the letters of Libanius are addressed not just at anybody, but at people all over. Especially the eastern half, but also the western half of the Roman Empire. And the range of people in that network goes from emperors to his alumni, to his family members, to governors, etc. All the letters are by Libanius. There is no replies of his correspondence. Still, even though all the letters are by Libanius, it's very well possible to deduce network data from them, because if Libanius recommends Alupius, the son of Philippus, to Severus, then obviously there is a relation between these 4 people is being created. Libanius's letters, that's the reason also why I think this research is relevant. Libanius's works actually are one of our main sources on the history and especially on the prosopography of the later Roman Empire, and also an important source of information on the socio-cultural history of late antiquity. Now, the image which scholars have constructed on the works of on the basis of the works of Libanius is that this was a world of intense change and tensions. 4th century AD, the empire is Christianizing. The emperors are trying to centralize power in the capitals, so whether they be Rome, Constantinople, or other capitals at a later date. They need specialists in law, and in order to do law, you need to know Latin. So that's the kind of new wave. But at the same time, of course, there is still many pagans in the Roman Empire. People are still living in majority in the city culture, so in the polis, especially in the east. And Greek rhetoric remains the basic formation of most elite men in the empire. Libanius was a professor of Greek rhetoric in a major city, so he is seen as a representative of this conservative approach. And as a result of that, scholars have made two assumptions, and that will bring me to the starting point for my network analysis. First, it is assumed that as a result of his minority position, Libanius must have taken a polemical stance defending paganism against Christianity, the cities against the center, Greek against Latin, and rhetoric against law. And second, it is assumed that as having the profile he had, Libanius must have done badly under the Emperor Constantius II, must then have flourished under the pagan Julian, and must then have again lost his influence under the Christian emperors that succeeded Julian. Now, if you look for passages confirming this view in Libanius's works, you will very easily find them. But then what you're doing is making a very careful selection in view of what you want to read, basically, and is also qualitative analysis without really bringing in the data from a quantitative analysis. And this is where I think that social network analysis can provide an important corrective. Because social network analysis, by definition, means that you're going to study the whole letter collection. And that will give you a view of the whole of Libanius's network. Also, qualitative analysis will still be important because, as I said earlier, and as I will demonstrate later on, you need to construct a notes list and an edge list. Into which, in order to construct which, you have to do a qualitative analysis, but you will also be able to provide a quantitative data on how many people of which status, of which geographical region, of which religious affiliation, etc., are really present in this network, and that's important, and what kind of interaction Libanius has with these different kinds of people. And then what social network analysis also will allow me to do is to sketch a diachronic evolution, because these 1544 letters are dated quite precisely to, say, to a year's, I mean, barring a couple of months at most. And so what I want to do is to see how this network changes in order to see whether that fluctuating network theory can hold through. I think that if I apply a social network analysis to this corpus, I will actually end up with a very different image of Libanius. I think that the letters are above all designed to bridge divides rather than to create or to reinforce them. I also think that it's important to see that one's influence in society is not necessarily linked or is not necessarily equal to one's relations with the person of the emperor. Of course, Libanius knew Julian, the Emperor Julian, much better than he ever knew any of the other emperors. But if you know, say, all the courtiers who surround Theodosius, you may equally well be able to influence the emperor's decisions than when you know only the emperor but not the courtiers around him, and these courtiers may act against you, for example. So that's the kind of corrective I think I shall be able to offer. So how am I going to do this? I think I will need to take 4 steps, and each one of these steps presents some serious problems. The first step will be to move from text to a database, and that's the step I'm working on right now, and which I will zoom in on in a minute. After this first step, what I'll need to do is to move from my database to graphs and numerical analysis. Now, one of the questions I'm facing there is which software I'm going to, which SNA software I'm going to use. On the one hand, there is NetDraw, which is quite straightforward to use and which is what most people working on the ancient world, doing network analysis for the ancient world, are using. But that's above all intended to study complete or interpersonal networks, where of course what I will be doing is to study an ego network. And you can imagine, for example, that in terms of degree centrality, of course Libanius is going to be the most central person in his own network. That's self-evident. So the calculations which a NetDraw would give me will not always be equally useful to me. So I'm now considering using Ego-Net, but that's a whole lot more difficult to use. So I'm still wavering between which one I'll go for. The other problem connected to that is how do you graphically represent an ego network? If you think for just 1 minute, what you will have is that Libanius is in the middle, and he will be the middle point of a huge star, because all the people that will be involved in my database are in some way or other related to him, otherwise they would not be there. So what I'll do in my graphical representation is I'll leave out Libanius, and I'll just represent the relationships which he states as a fact, or which he tries to create between other people in his network. And we'll see that in a detail when I go into the first step again. But then if I leave out Libanius, that also means that I'm going to leave out or to cut myself off from the possibility of adding value to the lines that would have linked Libanius to these individual nodes in his network, because a classic one is that the thickness of the line will represent the number of interactions or the importance which a person has in the network. And of course there's ways around this. I can give a person a big dot when he is important, so instead of the thick line, a person can get a big dot, but you need the size of your dots for other purposes as well. So for example, to say how much this dot is related to other people except from Libanius. So I still have to think carefully about how I'm going to graphically represent that ego network. Another question is, or well, no, that's actually another point is that I want to have not just one network, but rather a series of networks, so that I can a series of networks for Libanius at different points in time, so that I can compare his network in, say, the 350s to his network in the 360s or his network in the 390s, and see how that network changes, who the people are who still occur in all of these networks, which people have changed, but also if people recur in several networks, whether their position changes. Say, if somebody was first just an advocate, then becomes a provincial governor or a prefect, does the kind of interaction which Libanius has with him, or the kind of use Libanius makes of him, does that change with the changing position of this person? And so that's the diachronical evolution I want to put in my networks, or in my graphs rather. Once I will have entered the databases into the software and will have the graphs, then, as I said, I think at least as interesting will be the indicators that will help me to interpret the data that are in the databases. So that's the moment when I will be able to answer these two questions, or to test these two hypotheses I talked about earlier, about the bridging the divines and about the importance, only relative importance of emperors within the network. And of course, as I said, what is important is to just have one network. Then you can say, like, oh, Libanius, the density of his network is, say, 38%. But what does that tell me? What am I with just the data that it's 38% density? That's not interesting in itself. What you need is a point of comparison. And one idea could have been to compare the density of Libanius' network with the density of other people's networks, say a network today or the network of the Medici family. But of course, then the problem is always that you're talking about a very different kind of source material, very different sources, and so that might lead to an unfair comparison. So in a first stage, what I'll do is I'll have this Libanius network at different points in time. So I'll compare Libanius to himself at different stages in his life and in the lives of his correspondees. And in a second stage, I might, but that's maybe not a one man's or not even a one woman's work, I might want to do the same job again for other ancient authors, say for Cicero, for Pliny, and then compare Libanius' network to the network of these other authors. But that's definitely for a later stage. I'm first going to try and do this for Libanius. And then the last step I'll have to take is to move from this analysis to the presentation of the results. As I said, the whole project is part of a monograph I'm writing on the letters, in which, of course, you can print some graphs, etc. But I think there's more into this than just printing the graph, in which I would choose which are the interesting things to see in this graph or in these databases. And I think it would be much more interesting to have the book accompanied by some form of online publication, online available, to put online available databases and also the network software, so that people can select which nodes they are interested in. Say somebody is doing research on Hierocles or on Alupius, and they want to see what kinds of person or to what extent Alupius corresponded or used, say, Praetorian prefects, in Libanius' presentation at least, then they would be able to do that online with this digital publication as well. But this is something which I'm still trying, or still only starting to think about, so I'd be really grateful for suggestions as to how that could be done And especially also for, I mean, in terms of IT support and maintenance, how these things can be done. And I'm sure here within the Topoi Excellence Cluster, there must be a lot of know-how on these issues. But so that's only the fourth step of my project, whereas now I'm only in the first step. The good news for me is that Libanius' letters are available in a good Teubner edition, with only very minor problems left concerning the text itself. Much more difficult is the situation with translations, because less than 900 out of the 1500 letters have been translated. These 900 letters, or these 850 translated letters are spread out over 6 or 7 different selections, and it's not that one person selected letters 1 to 100, the next person selected nicely letters 200 to 300, etc. It's all spread out in view of particular ideas which people had, and the translations are not always very good, so I have to start in any case from the Greek texts. Which is not always an easy thing, because, well, it's very late Greek. On average, overall, it's okay, and it's readable and understandable. But of course, as in all ancient letters, as you know, there's lots of implied knowledge, which it's difficult for us to understand, but which the addressee would have understood, or which would have been provided by the bearer of the letter. And Libanius very often in his letter says, like, my dear friend, please accept the letter which Olympius is going to give to you, and he will give you the details on the situation here with me. And so we, of course, don't have that extra information. So on the basis of that kind of letter, I'm trying to construct a node list and an edge list. And I'll show you what the problems involved in this are. And I'll use, just by way of example, one short letter to show you how this works. It's letter 390, one of the earliest letters which we have, dated to early 355 AD. To Hierocles. Be assured that the ill feeling you have come to entertain for this man is a great blow to me, to your brothers, and to all who entertain goodwill towards you. But even worse than this is the death of Chromatius, my companion. We shared the same roof at Athens. Later, he urged me to return home again, that is, to Antioch, and upon my arrival was worth many a supporter, though he knew that through his devotion to me, he would annoy a certain person. You should rejoice at having had such a nephew and son-in-law, and persuade your daughter to do the same. As regards the disturbance here, I call upon you to reconcile the one who is angered. Now, first, so I have underlined in the text all the notes in this letter. First, of course, there is the problem of the anonymy. Do you include them or do you leave them out? For example, this group of all who entertain goodwill towards you, I left it out of my database because I don't think it's specific enough, and I don't think it will yield me any usable or useful information. On the other hand, the individuals which are referred to in a more particular context, for example, the ill feeling you have come to entertain for this man, that's a rather particular instance, then I will have included this man in the database, which you will get to see in a minute. In some cases, of course, you can try to guess who an anonymous is. In this last sentence, for example, to reconcile the one who is angered, I think, or it might be, that this is a reference to the Emperor Gullas. The Caesar, so the minor emperor Gullas, why do I think this? Well, because of other references in Libanius' letters, but also because of the description of Gullas' reign in Antioch, which you have in the first books of Ammianus. Now, I'm of course tempted to enter this person into my database as the Emperor Gullas, but that's of course a very dangerous path to take as well, or one to tread on very carefully, because whether or not Libanius, Hierocles would be able to assuage an emperor or not, that's of course a very big difference. Whether whether Libanius had access to the Emperor Gullas through just one step. So that's through this one person Hierocles. So that's something to be very careful about. And I think as long as I can't know for sure, and I'm going to be rather to err on the careful side, on the safe side, rather than make assumptions which I can't really substantiate. A second question is, how far do you go? How much information do I include? For example, this reference to your brothers. Do I change that into the names of these brothers? In this case, I did, because we know from many letters of Libanius that Hierocles had two brothers, Demetrius and Julianus. But suppose this would not have been included in Libanius himself, but only in another author. Do I include that as well? Now, as long as it's just giving me more information on the people in the letter, I think I'm going to do this. But suppose I look up one of these brothers, say Demetrius, in the prosopography of the later Roman Empire, and Martindale and Jones tell me that Demetrius also occurs in Ammianus, where he is linked to 10,000 other people, who are in turn, of course, linked to other people, who are in turn also linked to other people. So potentially this is an endless story, because you can always go on to see how large this network is. Now, if you're an historian or a sociologist, I think it would definitely be more interesting to include the friends of Libanius' friends, which we don't know about from his own works, but so to include all the information we have potentially from this period. Now, I'm very lucky or happy that I'm a philologist, and I can say I will first concentrate on just this one work, which is already a very big corpus, as I said. But I mean, apart from, of course, the fact that this is much less work than if you have to include all the people from the other sources as well, it has the extra value that I shall be able to say something on Libanius' network as it is seen through his eyes, as Libanius wants us to see his network. And that will tell us something not just about this network, but also about what Libanius, what a 4th century Greek rhetorician thought important, what his mentality would have been. And then the last question regarding the note list regards prosopography. So there is the PLRE by Jones and Martindale, but there is also a specialized prosopographical study of the letters of Libanius, published by Otto Seek in 1906. So it's been outdated by the PLRE, but the PLRE does not include all people. It includes only people from a certain social status or a certain office upwards rather. And even more complex is the fact that Otto Seek and Jones and Martindale are not always in agreement as to which person a certain person is. Say, the PLRE might say that this Hierocles is Hierocles 14, whereas who was prefect in that year, whereas Seek might say that this is Hierocles number 3, who was only ever a governor, for example. In the best case scenario, I will be able to correct some of the data of the PLRE on the basis of my research if I see that that doesn't fit together. But in the worst case scenario, of course, I have a problem and I can't know which of the two existing prosopographies is right or wrong. So if I put all this information together, I end up with a note list such as this one, where you see that every single person who was in the letter, so Demetrius and Julianus are the two brothers, so I've resolved, or I've put in the names, but where you see that they are all present several times. And that is because, of course, within the course of their lives, they changed their positions, they changed their jobs, and therewith also their status and also their potential influence. And as I want to represent Libanius' network at different points in time, I think it's only fair to take into account that the positions of these people also change. So that's why they're all there several times, and of course the note will remain. They will be the 6 times Hierocles will in the end be reduced to one person, but in the different databases showing the different years, he will appear, say, in a different color, which then symbolizes his position in these different stages. Now, this node list is only one of the 2 databases I am constructing. And the second being the edge list. Now, the first thing when building this edge list we always have to keep in mind is that we only get to see everything as Libanius presents it to us. So the only thing we know for sure is that Libanius wrote a letter to Hierocles, although if you're skeptical, you can't even know that, because we know, of course, that ancient letters are highly literary products, which may not have been, which may never have been sent, according to some people, and which may, in any case, and I'm pretty sure that that's the case in Libanius, which will have been adapted before they were published. But what we get to see is how Libanius wants us to see his network, and that's especially important for the edge list. Now, as I said, so it's difficult to, who can confirm that Hierocles conceived an ill feeling, or now that Chromatius is dead, who can confirm from us that he shared Libanius' apartments in their study time in Athens? So that's, that needs to constantly be kept in mind. The second question is, are we interested in relationships or are we interested in interactions? That's the famous, what you read often in social network analysis literature is, are we interested in the river or the riverbed? Is it interesting to know that Libanius had access to a certain person, or is it interesting to know that he did, or sometimes he did not make use of that access he had. And what I've done thus far is to record both relationships, such as family relationships, friendship relationships, etc., but also and especially to note down the interactions, because I think you need both. You need to know whether he knew somebody, whether he was connected to somebody, but it's interesting to see whether or not he makes use of that connection. Yeah, and also another thing is that when you're making the edge list, it's dangerous that, there's always the danger that you forget things. For example, it's obvious, of course, that there is not just the relationships which have the interactions which have underlined, but there's also the interaction of writing to somebody. There is the relationship of being a family member to somebody. But for example, if Hierocles has 2 brothers, and if it's later mentioned that Chromatius is his nephew and his son-in-law, that means that there is also a connection, of course, between, or there may be, unless it's the other family branch, but we know in this case that it's the case. So that means that there's also a connection between the brothers of Hierocles and Chromatius and Hierocles' daughter. So these are all relationships which need to go into the edge list. And so even though this is a very short, well, I've abbreviated it a bit, but even though this is a very short letter, many relationships are implied in it. A smaller question maybe is how many kinds of edges to distinguish. Do we subsume brother, daughter, nephew, son-in-law into one big group of just family relation? Or can ill feeling, great blow, and is angered, can they all be classified as enmity? Now, if we subsume all these relationships or interactions under fewer categories, we get, of course, a much clearer, especially a clearer graph. But this comes at the expense of precision. Because, well, to entertain all those who entertain goodwill towards you need not necessarily be the same intense relationship as the friendship relationship between Libanius and Chromatius, for example. So, in the first stage of building the database, I'm now trying to keep the number of the kinds of edges very large. And I may later decide that I'm going to subsume several of them into just one big group. But I think it's easier to do it this way around than if I would decide at a certain point of time, I want to know how these how everything that I've labeled as friendship differs from one another. And then the final challenge I've encountered thus far whilst constructing my edge list is the beginning or the chronology, the chronological evolutions. As I said, I wish to compare Libanius' network at various points in time. Yet that implies that the edge list lists carefully when a relationship or an interaction starts and when it ends. In some cases that's easy. For example, we know that the death of Chromatius took place in very early 355, and so therefore that's the end of Chromatius's family relationship with Hierocles, with his wife, etc. But what, for example, of the ill feeling with which Hierocles has conceived for this man, or again, when is later? And for how long did Libanius, Hierocles, and his daughter mourn over Chromatius? And that's difficult, and I'm not quite entirely sure how I can do that in my database. So yeah, that's again an overview, but this is what that letter would yield in terms of a database, whereas you see that, where you see again that so all the individual interactions or relationships are listed separately and as far as possible, but as you see there is one case where it's not possible, and there is a couple of cases where it's only with difficulty possible, their starting and end dates. Also, the relationships or the interactions here, I've not always very clearly indicated in what direction they go, although in most of the, so I've not listed Chromatius is related to Hierocles and Hierocles is related to Chromatius, but I think that that's, most people do actually do that, but I think it's pretty straightforward that a family relationship is by definition mutual, whereas the way in which I formulate my interaction makes it pretty clear in what direction the interaction that I noted in the letter has gone. Last but not least, what kind of conclusions do I think I'll get? As far as my own book is concerned, I think I'll be able to draw three kinds of conclusions. First, I hope to give an overview of the status, the religions, affiliations, and, as far as it is possible to know that, the geographical spread of Libanius' network. So these are the three attributes I listed in my note list. Next, I hope to gain insight into the diachronical evolution of Libanius' network, and more particularly on the question of whether Libanius lost as much of his influence after Julian as is usually assumed. And third, I hope to show how Libanius used his network, not just to see who is in that network, but also which contexts he uses, for what purposes and when, and to what extent he is aware of the uses of the fact that he's using his network in order to reach, is using people in his network to reach people that maybe might have otherwise been beyond it. In addition to these conclusions for my own book, I think that my SNA analysis of Libanius' letters may have some wider implications. So as I already said, there may be some corrections to prosopography, but also I think I'll gain insight into 4th century social interaction and into 4th century mentality, how people wanted to be seen and how people present their network to posterity and to their own contemporaries. Thank you.